Hey, I was inspired to make this video because of a problem of evil argument that I see Cosmic Skeptic make a lot. And I love Cosmic Skeptic's videos. I think he does a lot of very provocative content that really makes me think about belief. And one that he always returns to is the problem of animal suffering, which I think is actually a pretty good objection because, assuming there's a good God, it's pretty easy to say, oh, human suffering, I don't know, there's lots of arguments for it. Building character or being necessary for us to appreciate good, we need to have evil, all of that. But he basically makes the argument, well, these arguments don't apply to animals. And animals didn't do anything wrong. They can't really be accused of deserving punishment when it does come, or of profiting off of it. And I think this gets to a core distinction, which I think actually feels surprising, but then you should expect, right? I mean, a lot of theists make the objection that we believe something that undergirds morality and makes it make sense, right? There's the reverse problem of evil for atheism, too, right? A lot of theists will bring up where, yes, we have a problem to account for suffering, but you have a problem for how you even identify evil. What is evil in the atheist worldview, right? Suffering, sure. You could break that down to why do you care about other people suffering, why all those other objections. But I do think the atheists have a worldview that is good and evil. And what it is it's the accounting for suffering in the world, that's negative, and then pleasure in the world, and that's positive. And this is basically good, and this is basically evil. And a lot of these conversations about good and evil come to a place where the objections don't feel like they're meeting the claims. So Cameron Bertuzzi, for instance, in a debate I was watching that he's involved in with Cosmic Skeptic, and there's two other people at the table, he basically says, well, I don't know why you assume that we should try to avoid all suffering at all times, because it seems obviously necessary for any virtue, right? And Cameron is using the word virtue, right? Not good and not pleasure, right? They bring up the example of Martin Luther King Jr. and racism. And Alex, Cosmic Skeptic, basically just says, well, wouldn't it have been good if there was no racism in the first place, and then MLK wouldn't have been needed, and which we all recognize him as a good person, he wouldn't have been necessary if not for racism. And so wouldn't it have been better if we just never had racism rather than have the Martin Luther King's virtue? And Cameron just says, oh, what? No, I totally disagree. And it's because there's something different to the way that Christians or theists look at good and evil. Evil isn't really just suffering. In fact, I think the most redemptive moment in Christian history was also the point where the most undeserved suffering happened, right? That's what happens on the cross. So to say Christians have to accept the idea that they have to account for suffering as a defeater of Christianity, I don't really agree with that, because I think we have an entirely different schema of what good and evil is. And what I would say is that it's almost necessitating the atheist worldview. All right, so you might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, right, think about it like this. Atheists want there to be good in the world, pleasure, all these other things, and they want there to not be suffering in the world, because they can project their internal feelings of not liking suffering and enjoying pleasure onto other people, because we're empathetic creatures and we're social creatures, and they also don't want those things to happen to them. And they don't want them to happen to animals, right? That's where Alex's objection began. Okay, but what would be necessary to create a world like that? And I think the traits, the characteristics that would create that world are what the Christian is focused on. Not actually on the effects, not on pleasure, not on suffering. In fact, there's almost all of the biblical heroes have moments where even in their own lifetime, they can't see the redemptive quality of the suffering they're going through. I mean, people even Alex points out in other debates that a lot of the Christian story are characters who are objecting to their seemingly pointless suffering, like Job or in the book of Ecclesiastes. And that it just feels like Christianity is this purpose assignment to suffering so that we can endure it. Because we accept the fact that all suffering is basically pointless and that all suffering needs a reason for us to endure it meaningfully and to go on. Where on the other hand, I think the opposite is actually true. So, if you read the New Testament and the Epistle and Paul, and the way that he's talking about what the Christian life looks like, and even I would say this applies to the laws in Leviticus and Exodus and Deuteronomy, and what the law was trying to achieve in the Old Testament period was not an avoidance of suffering. In fact, all of the law implied punishment for evil, right? So you would say this suffering or whatever is due to that crime, right? So the crime is the evil, not the suffering it necessarily caused, although that's wrapped up in the crime, right? It's so hard to divorce those two concepts that Christians and atheists can have conversations using the different definitions the entire time and not realize they're talking about two different things. But they are two different things. And what would be necessary for all of that suffering to end, all of the goodness to be achieved, would be a completion of the human moral character in a way that that is like complete and perfect. Okay, there's no flaws in it. And what Christianity is struggling with is that never happens. No one ever really gets to that point here on earth. Okay, and so when you bring up the point of animal suffering, what you're actually showing, you're demonstrating, is that when God gave us, humans, free will and the ability to be those creatures that would eventually perfect ourselves in heaven, even if heaven, when heaven comes to earth, that perfect state of humanity is actually the only antidote to suffering. So when you point out why are animals suffering, it's actually the exact objection that theists bring to the problem of evil. Because if those animals, who basically don't have free will in the same way that humans do, they're biological creatures that have instinct, right? And they don't make decisions, they don't learn from them, they don't do anything. It actually demonstrates that in a world without human free will, which is what allows us to judge the conduct, characteristics of others, and then make good choices, it's kind of like, well, what's the difference, right? A lion eats a zebra, and you don't think of that as evil, because that's just in the nature of the lion, right? It's in the nature. What does in the nature mean? It means you couldn't have conceived of the lion making another choice, right? Because you're not going to argue with the lion about why that zebra has dignity. And so I think what you have to do at a certain point is take the animals out of the category that we put humans in, because they don't have that divine free will. Okay. Now, do you have to accept all that to become a theist? No. But that does delineate the line for conversations between theists and atheists, right? And it's why not a lot of atheists criticizing Christians on moral issues will say, well, lots of atheists are vegans or vegetarians and Christians aren't. So if Christianity is supposed to make people more nice, why does it seem like atheists have more sympathy for animals? And that kind of, there's like lots of, if you look at the history of kosher laws, right, what was the motivating moral factor there? It was how you treat animals, okay? And that's a whole other conversation about the slaughtering rituals. But aside from that, it might be true, but it's because Christians are still able to make the distinction between the moral ability of a human and the moral ability of an animal, and still say that that's fundamental to moral rules. So that moral rules do not apply to animals. And so when you take away the Christian worldview, an atheist who doesn't have that Christian worldview will say, actually, the rules do apply to animals. and they don't have a reason for why they don't apply to animals. And then you look at the world and then you say, oh my God, look at what's going on with animals. Look at the horrible suffering. Look at the horrible, imperfect, painful world that the animals live in our fallen state, right? And they would say, well, either they can come to two conclusions. They can come to the conclusion that I think Cosmic Skeptic comes to, which is we should work to a world where that no longer happens to animals either, right? And they become a vegetarian, which I believe Cameron is a vegetarian. He may even be a vegan. Not Cameron, to Alex. Cosmic Skeptic is a vegetarian. Or they can do the second, which I think is the unspoken atheistic conclusion, which happens outside of these debates, is that they can make the conclusion that atheists in the 20th and 19th century made, like Nietzsche, like atheist fascists, like communists make, which is basically that there is the lack of moral dignity and order in the world of animals now applies to humans. And we can instantiate the rules that happen in the animal kingdom to our world. And a thought experiment that I want to press to atheists is, let's say you were having a conversation with Adolf Hitler, okay? I know this is weird, but bear with me. Adolf Hitler, oftentimes in movies and stuff like that, Nazis and Hitler are depicted as comparing Jewish people to animals, like rats or dogs or mutts or something, right? But the actually chilling characteristic of real life Adolf Hitler is that he thought it was okay to kill Jews, but he was a vegetarian. Isn't that like kind of jarring if you think about it, right? The moral, I think a lot of atheists or people today, modern people, Christian, not Christian, would assume is that obviously the moral hierarchy of importance goes humans first, animals of different kinds, and then eventually maybe, amoebas, right? I think Trent Horn even brings up when he, in a conversation with Alex, like, okay, well, where do you stop? Like, why is it bad to cure yourself of a virus if the living organisms of the virus in your body, right? But that's a whole other conversation. It's assumed that there's a descending characteristic. But how would you actually be able to morally convince Adolf Hitler that worldview was inconsistent, right? I mean, he could even say something like, and he maybe did or didn't believe this. I don't want to get into the whole idea of whether or not he was just using Jews as a scapegoat or really believed in Nazism. But in his mind, and I've heard some modern atheists even say this, humans can be more morally blameworthy than animals because they can make evil decisions, right? And maybe he believed, rightly or maybe he believed honestly or dishonestly that Jews were plotting to overthrow Western civilization. They were more morally blameworthy than animals are. And so humans actually deserve less dignity than animals. And I don't think that there's a very good atheist answer to that question without dealing with some kind of innate human dignity that is tied to our moral ability. That might be heavy, but I think that's an interesting challenge. Hopefully someone will take it up. Thank you.